Hey World History, and welcome to your final lesson, junior pod lesson, of the entire year. How crazy is that? So today, yesterday we talked about all the revolutions in Latin America, and the last 3 days we've been talking about revolutionary spirits in Europe. But now we're going to talk about, for today, for our last day, we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. And we're going to talk about how that really was the other key of setting the stage for basically the foundations of our life today. Obviously, there's lots of differences in there, and there's been lots of developments over the last several years, 100 years. But ultimately speaking, the Industrial Revolution was one of the things that really tilted the world towards modernization. So it brought great riches to most entrepreneurs who helped set it in motion. Unfortunately, it didn't really bring great riches to everybody else. So we are actually today just looking at sections 3 and 4 of chapter 19 on the Industrial Revolution, and then that'll be it. Next week we'll do some other stuff. So in time, reforms are going to curb many of the worst abuses of the early industrial age. But a lot of working people really suffered during the Industrial Revolution. Unsafe, unsanitary working conditions, dangerous working conditions, unsafe, unsanitary, and overcrowded housing, and poverty that you just really couldn't get out of. So, cities. Why are people moving to cities? The Industrial Revolution brings urbanization, which means that you have a lot of people moving to cities. And urbanization basically means that after urbanization, now more people live in cities than in the country. Why? Well, you've got changes in farming, soaring population growth, and especially demand for workers. You need people to work in the factories. And so people are offering jobs and hourly wages to people to move to the cities, which of course as a farmer you don't get hourly wages. You get, you reap from the harvest and whatnot. And so the hourly wages looked a lot more stable to a lot of people, which is why they wanted to move. The British market town, for example, in Manchester numbered 17,000 people in the 1750s. By 1780 it was 40,000 people. By 1801 it was 70,000 people. Visitors described the cloud of coal vapor that polluted the air because the pounding noise of the steam engines, the filthy stench of the river, and the growth of industry just kept letting out smoke. And then you also have some new social classes. So you have a new middle class along with a working class. So now it's not, we talked about this a little bit over the last couple of days. Now it's not just like your rich people, a couple of merchant, middling people, and then your peasants. Now you have a much more stable middle class, and your middle class is the one that's owning and operating the new factories, mines, railroads, other industries. Their lifestyle is a lot more comfortable than the industrial working class. The industrial working class are the people that work in the mines or the factories or for the railroads. Many are lost and bewildered, uncomfortable environments, unsafe conditions. But in time, this class sort of develops its own identity, its own community. But they're, of course, not your super poor, not your peasants, not the people that don't have jobs, beggars, things like that. So those who benefited most from the Industrial Revolution were not actually your upper class. They were your middle class, the entrepreneurs, this new bourgeoisie, kind of a rags to riches pattern. Middle class families lived in pretty well furnished, spacious homes on paved streets. They had supplies of water. They could wear fancy clothing. They ate well. They took pride in their hard work. They believed that their hard work was what was getting them ahead. And many of them did not have sympathy for the poor because they thought that the poor could get to where they were if they worked harder. Women of the middle class generally did not leave the house to work. They generally focused their energy on raising children, which contrasted with the wealthy, because the wealthy hired servants to look after their children. And in the working class, the children were part of the workforce. So everybody kind of treated their children differently. The working class, though, they didn't live in nice houses on nice streets. They lived in tenements, which are multi-story buildings divided into apartments. Tenements usually didn't have running water. They only had community pumps. There's no sewage or sanitation system, so usually the waste and the garbage would just get dumped onto the street and stay there. Sewage would sometimes be dumped into the rivers, which would smell and contaminate your drinking water, which would lead to the spread of diseases. If you can't drink clean water, you're going to get diseases. So let's do some classes here. The wealthy, your middle class, your industrial working class, and then your If they were out in the rural area, they'd be peasants, serfs, beggars. That type would be at the bottom. Workers would start to stage protests because of the conditions being so bad. And you would have, and labor unions were actually illegal at the time. So those are like workers' organizations that help fight for fair treatment. Secret unions did exist. They wished to initiate worker reforms, such as increases in pay, but they had no political power to make the change. So then this would often lead to riots. So 1811 to 1813, you had textile workers known as Luddites, who resisted the labor-saving machines that were costing them their jobs. Some of them smashed textile machines with sledgehammers or burned factories. They usually wore masks. They operated at night. And so they were really protesting not only the treatment, but the fact that their jobs were being replaced by machines. See, it even happened 200 years ago. A lot of working class people found comfort in a religious movement called Methodism. This movement was influenced by the Industrial Revolution. As people moved to the city, lost connections with their old churches. A guy named John Wesley founded the Methodist movement in mid-1700s. It is a Christian movement. I actually grew up Methodist. Methodist meetings featured hymns and sermons talking about forgiveness of sin, a better life to come. The Methodist preachers took this message of salvation into the slums. They hoped to rekindle hope. They set up Sunday schools, and in their Sunday schools, people would study the Bible. They would learn to read and write. Methodists helped channel workers' anger away from the revolution and towards reform. So it was a really powerful Christian movement happening particularly in England at the time. What's life like in the factories and in the mines, though? So working in a factory system differed greatly from working on a farm. In rural villages, people worked really hard, but their work varied according to the season. Life was also hard for poor rural workers who worked as part of the system, but at least they worked at their own pace. In the grim factories of industrial towns, they were forced to work at a pace set by the factory whistle. Working hours were long. Shifts would usually last 12 to 16 hours. So if you started your working shift at 8 a.m., you would get off work sometime between 8 p.m. and midnight. And you thought school was long. They would work 6 to 7 days a week. And you thought school was long. Workers could only take breaks when the factory owners gave permission. So if you took a break and you weren't allowed to, then you could be fired and you would lose your job, and jobs were kind of hard to come by sometimes. Exhausted workers that were working past the point of exhaustion, would probably suffer accidents because the machines had absolutely no safety devices. In a lot of textile mills, they could lose a finger, a limb, or anywhere. You could lose a finger, you could lose a limb, and you could be killed. And people were killed because of the lack of safety conditions. In the textile mills, workers were constantly breathing air filled with lint, which would damage their lungs. And if you became too sick to work, you would lose your job. If you became too injured to work, you would lose your job. There was no workers' comp. The majority of early factory workers were actually women rather than men. There were a couple reasons why the factory owners wanted to hire women. One, they thought that women could adapt more easily to machines. Two, they thought that women were easier to manage. And three, they really could get away with paying women about half of what they would have to pay a man. And so it cost them less money. Factory work was a double burden. Their new jobs took them out. So think about women. Their job takes them out of their home for 12 or more hours a day. Then they return to their tenements, which might be one damp room with one bed. Then, because men weren't always contributing, so they would then have to feed and clothe their families, clean, deal with sickness, deal with injury, all of that. Then you have miners, and miners faced even worse conditions because the Industrial Revolution is increasing the demand for iron and coal, so you need more mining. So they worked in darkness, and the coal dust absolutely destroyed their lungs. There were always dangers of explosions, flooding, collapsing tunnels. Women and children would join work in the mines as well. They would cart heavy loads of coal. Sometimes they would have to crawl on all fours through the tiny passages. And they would also climb ladders carrying heavy baskets of coal several times a day. Children as young as 5 could work in the mines and be paid for it. And so oftentimes that would be sometime between 5 and 8 would be when a child of the industrial working class would get their first job. And again, they would be working probably anywhere from 8 to 16 hours a day. So needless to say, let's talk about what the children were doing at their jobs. Factories and mines hired children. They could start They, like I said, they would often start working at ages 7 or 8, but they could start working at 5. Children had small fingers and they were quick, and so they would change spools. Think like a thread, what thread comes on, that circular thing, or that cylindrical thing, that's a spool. So you would change spools in the textile mills, and a lot of times you couldn't see because of all the dust. They would actually have to crawl under the machinery to repair broken threads, and they would have to climb on the machinery that's spinning. And if you slipped, or if your hair got caught, so if you had long hair and your hair got caught, it could pull out half your hair before you can do anything about it. And oftentimes people weren't allowed to stop working to help you. Conditions were even worse in the mines. Children would sit all day in the dark, opening and closing the air vents. They would haul coal carts in extreme heat. And because children had been helping with... So, okay, let's pause here for a second. Why would parents let kids do this? Well, children had been helping with work on the farm since they were 3 years old. And so parents thought, well, if they work on the farm, they can work in the factory, right? The wages the children earned were, quite frankly, needed to keep the families from starving. And so parents kind of accepted it. And it wasn't until into the 1800s when the first child labor reform laws were passed. Now, get this. The first child reform laws said that children could work no more than, guess how many hours? Guess how many hours was the maximum working day for a child? 12 hours. Children couldn't work more than 12 hours in a day. In a day, one day. They could work 7 days a week. And then they also wanted to remove children under the age of 8 or 9. So no more 5-year-olds. But if you're 8 or 9, you're okay. But the thing is, the laws were generally not enforced, and so the British lawmakers actually had to form teams of inspectors to ensure that the factories and the mines obeyed the laws in the 1830s and 40s. More laws were then passed to shorten the workday for women and require that child workers still had to get educated. So it's starting to get a little bit better. But results? Well, since the 1800s, people have debated whether or not the Industrial Revolution was a blessing or a curse. The early industrial age brought terrible, terrible hardships. In time, the reformers did press for laws to improve working conditions. Labor unions became legal and won the right to bargain with employers for better wages, better working hours, better working conditions. Eventually, working class men gained the right to vote, which gave them political power. Despite the social problems, there were some positive effects. New factories opened, wages rose, so that workers did have enough left after paying rent and buying food to buy a newspaper or go to a concert. And as the cost of railroad travel started to fall, people could visit family and travel to other towns. So things are opening up. There are positives in among all the negatives. But let's talk about some new ways of thinking that are also coming from this time. So laissez-faire economics. Some people say laissez-faire. It's French, so I can't pronounce it. For the record, I'm willing to learn. I just want to throw out there that I'm probably saying it slightly wrong. But Americans generally sort of mess with laissez-faire economics because we kind of coined the term. So, middle-class business leaders embrace laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means hands off. Whose hands? The government's hands. As you've learned, the main proponent of laissez-faire economic, his name is Adam Smith. We talked about him, The Wealth of Nations. Free market, unregulated exchange of goods and services. Government hands out. They thought it would help everyone, not just the rich, because it would produce more goods, lower prices, making them more affordable to everyone. A growing economy should also encourage capitalists to invest in the profits of new ventures, which allow new people to create businesses. And it, kind of works, kind of doesn't. Nothing's perfect. Then you have a guy, Thomas Malthus. He was a laissez-faire economic, and he believed that the population would soon outpace the food supply, meaning that there's too much population, and people keep having a lot more children, and that means that soon we will have more people than there is food. He said that the only checks on population growth were war, disease, and famine. As long as the population kept increasing, he worried that the poor would suffer. He urged families to have fewer children. He actually was an anti-vaxxer because he said, well, we need some form of population control, so no vaccines, just let them die. That was his thought. I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm just saying that's what he thought. During the 1800s, a lot of people accepted him because they saw the factory system and how it was really terrible. His views, though, eventually did prove wrong because the food supply continued to grow. The population did not outpace the food supply. Population growth was no longer a problem in the West, but it continued to affect a lot of nations elsewhere. And this was 200 years ago when there were far fewer people on the planet. Then you have a guy, David Ricardo. He's British. He dedicated himself to economic studies, and he did not hold out hope for the working class to escape poverty. He said that wage increases are futile because wage increases would only cover the cost of necessities. As wages go up, so do prices. And so no matter if your wages increase, you're not going to actually get any financial help. And then also, families often keep having more children when there's lots of money, when they have more money, and so then they have to pay for the extra children. Both Malthus and Ricardo opposed any government help for the poor. They wanted laws of the free market. But you had a couple other people that were different. So the utilitarianism movement, basically the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Okay, so let's talk about that. That one's nice and phonetic. So the idea that the goal of society should be greatest happiness for greatest number of people. All laws or actions should be judged by their utility. Did it provide more pleasure and happiness than pain? He supported individual freedom, but thought that the government should be involved under certain circumstances. So these influenced another British philosopher, John Stuart Mill, and he believed strongly in individual freedom, but he wanted the government to step in to help out the working class because they're really, really having a pretty miserable time. He said the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised is over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So basically saying the only time the government should step in and do something that the people didn't necessarily want is to prevent harm from coming to others. So basically, the middle class workers are entitled to increase their happiness, but the government should make sure that they don't do it at the expense of the poor workers. So he actually this philosopher Mill wanted to give the vote to workers and to women. He thought that they should be able to use their political power to win their own reforms through the political system. Of course, this doesn't happen right away, but eventually, by 1900, it does. But then we have another thought that's emerging, and that's socialism. So you hear socialism and you think bad because of everything in today's modern society. No, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that socialism is good, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that socialism is bad, but I'm going to sit here and tell you what socialism started out as. So you've got the champions of laissez-faire economics, and they're praising individual rights, free market, government go away. But the thinkers that developed socialism were focusing on the good of society in general. So they didn't want industrial capitalism because they believe that this capitalism is creating this immeasurable gap between the wealthy and the poor, and that the poor would never be able to work their own way out of it no matter how hard they worked. And so they offered this kind of radical solution of socialism. Under socialism, the people as a whole are going to own and operate the means of production. The means of production being farms, factories, railways, other large businesses. So instead of the government or instead of a couple people owning it, they wanted the people as a whole to own it. Socialism grew out of the Enlightenment faith in progress, basic goodness of the human nature, and its belief for social justice. One of the areas where socialism is a little bit tricky and where socialism leads to communism is the belief in the goodness of the human spirit. Humans are sinful by nature, and therefore if you depend on the goodwill and complete selflessness of everyone, it's not going to happen. That's one of the reasons why communism in particular has throughout history historically never worked and ended in tyrannical dictatorships. But socialism, they were really focusing on a utopia. They wanted early socialists established communities where all work was shared, all property is owned in common. When there's no difference between the rich and poor, they didn't think anybody would fight. And so they called them utopias. Utopia means, perfect society. It's where we get young adult fiction dystopian novels like Hunger Games. That means the opposite of perfect. They tried to make it perfect and it didn't work. Most utopias end up being dystopias. The utopian Robert Owen set up a community in Scotland, and he wanted to limit child labor. He wanted to help organize unions, but he also wanted to try and create a perfect society, and obviously that doesn't exist, not on Earth. Then we have another guy. So we just mentioned communism, but let's talk about how we get to communism. Karl Marx. So in the 1840s, Karl Marx was a German philosopher, and he condemned the ideas of the utopians. And we're almost done. He said it's unrealistic and it's idealistic. He formulated a new theory, scientific socialism, which he teamed up with another socialist, Friedrich Engels, whose father owned a textile factory in England. They wrote a pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto, which they published in 1848. And that is a very important pamphlet because it influenced a lot of things. So, they said a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. Communism is a form of socialism advocated by Marx. So basically, he wants to create a classless society, no social classes, where all means of production is owned entirely by the community. So it's the most extreme form of socialism, where there's no individual ownership of anything. Everybody owns everything. Everybody owns the farms, owns the houses, owns the properties. There's no class. No one owns more than other people. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx theorized that the economics was the driving force in history. He said that the history of class struggles between those that have and those that have not. The haves have always owned the means of production. The haves are the bourgeoisie. The have-nots are the proletariat, which is a new word that we'll talk about for the working class. So, Marx, you have... I still can't spell bourgeoisie. Good grief. Where is it? B-O-U-R-G-E-O. So versus proletariat. So your bourgeoisie is your middle class, and this is your working class. So your middle class, again, is the factory owners, and the proletariat is the people that working in the factory. According to Marx, the modern class struggles pit the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. In the end, he predicted that the proletariat is going to win. Workers would then take control of the means of production and set up this classless communist society. Such a society would mark the end of struggles. Marx despised capitalism. He says, no, it creates prosperity for only a few and poverty for the many. He wants them to unite. Of course, this sounds great to people. Classless society, the proletariat gets to own things and win things. It sounds very appealing, but what happens? So it gains popularity. Leaders of a number of reform movements adopt the idea that power should be held by the workers rather than the business owners. Marx's ideas, though, would never actually get practiced the way he imagined. So Marxism, in the 1860s, Germany, or what would become Germany, adapted Marx's beliefs to form like what's called a social democracy, which is a political ideology in which there's this gradual transition from capitalism to socialism. So they didn't want to just be like, okay, capitalism, bam, destroy, go away, now we're socialist. They wanted this social democracy, this transition period. In the late 1800s, Russian socialists also embraced Marxism, and the Russian Revolution of 1917 set up a communist-inspired government. And of course, this was the Bolshevik Revolution that started communism in Russia, actually withdrew Russia from World War I, and ended up setting the stage for eventually Joseph Stalin to commit mass genocide. So, but you'll learn about that at some other point in your life, because unfortunately we did not get to the world wars this year. Darn quarantine. Okay, so in time, lots of revolutionaries around the world would adapt Marxist ideas to their own situations. Independence leaders in Asia, Latin America, and Africa would all turn to Marxism because it sounded good. It just didn't work. So whenever you had communist governments in Latin America, this is where it comes from. Communist governments in Asia, China, this is where it comes from. But as time passed, the failures of Marxist governments illustrated the flaws in Marx's arguments. He predicted that the workers would unite, but instead nationalism wins out over working class loyalty. In general, people felt stronger ties to their country than to the international communist movement. You see, Marx also envisioned a society almost without countries, but he failed to realize that people would prefer to be connected to their country than to other people around the world who are in the same situation they are. By the end of the 20th century, few nations remained with communist governments, whereas nearly every economy in the world included some element of free market capitalism. Okay, so why did we end on that? We ended on that because this is the beginning of things that are still relevant in today's society. In the political debates happening right now, you will hear accusations of socialism. You'll understand a little bit more why people are nervous about that, because historically, people who want socialism sometimes eventually want to step it up into communism. However, there are elements of socialism that have never been increased into communism, and there are elements of capitalism that are bad, and elements of capitalism that are good. But what you need to do is you need to understand what all of this means, so that when you become an adult, you're able to participate in the political system and you're able to know what you're voting for. And I know this is kind of hidden behind the lens of the 1750s to the 1850s, But this stuff still happens. You're still a part of the middle class or the lower class or the upper class. And so that's why we're ending on this, because it matters. And you are going to hear those words: socialism, Marxism, the proletariat, laissez-faire economics, capitalism. These are all things that are still incredibly relevant in today's society. Okay? So it's been truly a pleasure this year. I'll send you out some more stuff next week, but this is the end of our actual lessons. So thanks, y'all. And if you're watching this and you made it all the way through, I'll give you extra credit for telling me 2 new terms that I talked about today that you've heard about in life around you, whether it's the political movement or what. Okay? So extra credit for telling me 2 terms that I talked about today that you've heard going on in the world around us. All right? So with that said, I hope you all have an awesome rest of your day, and I will hopefully see you very soon. Bye.